Welcome to the Power Curve. I'm Holly Scott. In our podcast, I have the opportunity to chat with accomplished industry executives regarding their career and decisions they've made along the way, with the idea of empowering you, our audience, as you navigate your own career trajectory. Today, I am pleased to have Tracy MacNeal, the CEO of Materna Medical, and also a participant in AdvaMed. She's on the board and been a significant advocate for women's health throughout her career. Thanks for joining us today, Tracy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. As mentioned, we talk career, we think about where you start and where you've come, how far you've come. So I have to start at the beginning. I believe that foundation is laid early in life, even in childhood. So could you share with us a little about what career meant in your household, a bit about your foundation?
Yeah, I grew up in a family I would describe as lower middle class educated, which as I've gone on in my career, I realized was actually quite privileged. But at the time, we didn't have a lot of money. My dad was a social worker who specialized in children who were behaviorally and emotionally disturbed with violent tendencies. These are mostly kids that come from terribly abusive backgrounds and have really tough situations. So I think that gave me a background of caring for people, and we grew up in a very empathetic kind of household. And my mom was a school teacher. She taught high school French for 40 years before she retired, and she loved it because the curriculum wasn't set by the state, and so she got to have a lot of creative input into what she taught. And she's a very cultured person. She's still alive and one of my best friends. And I think we were always expected to be educated and to do our best. We were high achievers. That was definitely an expectation, but there was nobody in my family who was an engineer. I didn't even know what engineers were. I thought they drove trains. So I found out about it in high school when a civil engineer came and talked to my trigonometry class, actually. And so for the people in the audience who think that they don't have enough time to go talk to kids, you can change people's lives. This engineer came and talked to my class about how she used math in her everyday life. And I had didn't know people used math for anything. Nobody in my family used math for anything. But I was good at math. I was like, oh, I think I could do this. And I went to the library and researched it. This was before the internet. And I was like, hey, I think I can do it. And I never looked back. I decided to major in chemical engineering, and I was off to the races. My parents just kind of scratching their heads and like, well, okay.
Wow, what a foundation. You mentioned did you have siblings?
Yeah, that's funny. My sister is my best friend. She looks just like me too. So it's like the universe did like a copy paste. But she is a database designer and is just one of the funniest people I know. She should have been a screenwriter.
Is she younger or older?
She's older.
Okay.
But these days you can't really tell looking at us.
Okay, so close, but you were the younger of the two.
I was, yeah, I'm the baby. Yep, it's just the
Interesting.
two of us. Mm-hmm.
Interesting that you both gravitated towards more data-driven, at least educational foundations with such a high degree of empathy from both sides of your parents.
It's a great point. I never really thought about it like that. And I would say she and I, when we geek out about work, we're usually talking about leadership challenges and organizational development challenges. Like how do you get feedback to people? How do you clarify whether there's a communication problem or a competency problem, right? And it's a never-ending journey.
Mm-hmm.
Boys, leadership, a never-ending journey.
And your awareness around that is remarkable. Even in our prior conversations, you mentioned that. And it stands out because so many individuals, especially young and going back as early as high school, if they're STEM driven, they tend to operate, that's their superhero power, that's their comfort zone as well. And getting on the other side of their brain, getting into that empathetic quarter, into those skills to have the ability to listen, collaborate, engage, influence, that can be incredibly difficult. just like putting the art major in your trig class. It really goes against the grain of what they're naturally doing. So in retrospect, if you think about the foundation that you and your sister grew up in, you had the home education that facilitated that side of your world and of your leadership capabilities, and then you went on and got that really strong STEM engineering foundation.
No, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. And I think it's so tempting for me too, as an engineer, to want the world to be predictable, to want the story to be linear. And for those of us that work in medical technology innovation, we all know it's anything but linear. And we tell the story. Well, you do your first, you get your prototype and your first in human and your pilot and your plan, and you do all the things, and then there you go, A to Z. But I think if you talk to anybody who's actually done it a few times, it's just not linear. And so having that ability to flex and pivot and listen, to yourself and to your board and to your employees, to your customers, your clinicians, and synthesize all of that in a way that when it cuts through the noise. It's almost like people are. I always thought this when I left engineering and went more to management and leadership, that people and leadership is basically an engineering system. It's just that people are not linear. So how do you deal with that component in a way that's thoughtful and productive? And that to me is the thing that's the most fascinating part of my journey as a leader. Still, it's like, and I'll never get bored. It's never boring. That's for sure.
That's really interesting. I feel a lot of what you shared with the line of work that we are in, because at the end of the day, I could tell you on a piece of paper with lots of data how to plan and execute a search, even how to build out an organization and what functions you need. But when you add the dynamic that we deal with people on every end of that, if you're not prepared for those surprises, if you're not prepared for the individuality of every decision you make, you can be caught off guard. So building into that plan, whether as a leader or as on a project, or building in any way, gives you that little bit of flex and luxury to accommodate and do what you need to do to get out that optimal result.
Totally. And it's a funny thing, because sometimes we wonder, does having a fallback plan make my plan A compromise in any way?
Mm-hmm.
Like, am I sandbagging, or right? But I think that, so I was just reading a book by Bill Walsh. We're a 49ers family, for what it's worth. And one of his leadership tenets is that good leaders plan to fail. Everyone is defeated. And if you're planning to be resilient when defeat happens, you're going to handle it like everybody loses games. That happens.
Certainly.
Right? You just want to be the type of player that wins more than you lose.
There you go. There you go. Not every strategy can be burning the boats. Not every strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
You just can't do it. Wow. So engineering, Duke, nice strong foundation. And did you get, what was your first role out of college?
It was the only job I think I ever blindly applied for and got. The rest of my career has been much more connected and different. But I just did the old school. I put my resume in a paper envelope and put it in the mail, and I applied for a program that Merck was hiring for. Merck, so Merck and Company, and they so big pharma. They had a program called the Manufacturing Management Development Program. And it was a totally new program. We were the first group that went through it. I later found out they received thousands, I think 3,000 resumes for 12 positions. And
wow.
I showed up on the first day and looked at the other 11 people and realized that they were looking for something very specific, because all 12 of us were very similar kinds of people.
Uh-huh.
So all top schools, but not the 4.0 students. I was like a 3.3. Like, I was A's and B's. At a top school, I was not the smartest.
Okay.
Person.
Okay.
I was I was good and I worked really hard. But I was not a natural 4.0 student at one of the best schools.
Mhm.
So, and everybody else was like that too. But so we were all competent, but we were all good communicators. And part of the application was, and I was 21 because I've got a fall birthday. I was like young. I think I was just 20 or something when I was applying for all this and going through it. We had to do a prepared presentation. We had to do a, 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 a spontaneous presentation where they asked us something we didn't know that what they were going to ask and speak about it. And we had to do a writing test where we went into a room and we were asked to write an essay on something we hadn't prepared for. And it was such fun. And it was 2 years of rotational assignments. We did 4 6-month rotations, and the first 2 were technical rotations. So my first one was like out in the factory with a hard hat and safety glasses and all of that, and doing the scale up of big. We were working on the active ingredient
Okay.
of pharmaceuticals because we were all chemical engineers.
Mm-hmm.
So not so much on the tableting and
Mm-hmm.
oral suspensions, all that. We were like running the reactions to make the active ingredient in these huge reactors, crystallization. It was so fun.
It's big stuff. That's good stuff. It's
Steel
I'm
toe
picturing
boots.
it and thinking that's
Yeah.
exciting for a 21-year-old.
Like shiny new engineer, rolls up to the factory. And then I did a laboratory rotation in doing process improvements on the bench and then scaling them up out in the factory. And then I went to the corporate headquarters for 2 rotations and did a rotation in new product planning. So I was part of the group that calculated how much product we would need for the launch and working with the supply chain to make that happen. It was such an amazing assignment. I loved that. And then, and that was definitely influential on where I took my career. And then I did a 4th rotation in specialty procurement. So negotiating the contracts for the special things that you need to run those kinds of reactions and figuring out sources of supply and cost and quality and all of those things. And then after I finished that program, I stayed with Merck for 3 more years and had a wonderful time, did some expat assignments, but it was hardcore engineering. I mean, we were doing designing heat exchangers and building out facilities. But I had gotten that taste for business early and I really, really liked it. And I decided I wanted to get my MBA. So they wanted to sponsor me for my PhD and kind of take me on that track. And I just didn't want a PhD in chemical engineering.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted an MBA and I wanted to follow that path of leadership and business and communication.
Where were you living at the time? You're from California originally, correct?
I'm not. I'm originally from North Carolina, actually.
Oh, okay. So you were from North Carolina and then went to Duke. Okay.
I went to Duke. And well, I did my undergrad up at Cooper Union in New York City. I don't know
Okay.
if you know Cooper Union. If you don't know, you should look it up. It's a very cool little school. Everybody goes for free. But it's a small group right there in Greenwich Village. And then I did my MBA at Duke later. And all this was in between. But I really lived in the Northeast for a long time. And then I lived in England for 2 years as an expat. And then I just relocated to California 6 years ago. So I would not say I'm a Bay Area native by any stretch, but it is very nice here.
It's nice. It's nice. And given the history that you've had in companies and young companies, I thought you'd been out there a little longer than that. So that's really interesting.
I landed in the most wonderful group of people. The Bay Area medtech community is larger than any of the other communities in the country. And so I had been relatively by myself. I would have to travel to see my people kind of thing. And so here, and not only that, I was relocated out here by my previous company, and then Materna found me on LinkedIn. And they were running a search for their commercial CEO. And I had not heard of any of the things that Materna was working on. Had not been thinking about doing a startup. Startups are a hassle. So, but I just got more and more interested. But I was really fortunate that Materna had been accepted into Fogarty Innovation. And so we were a company in residence when I got here, and they have continued to want us to stay. And it's just lovely. And they have connections with Stanford Biodesign. So I have, over 100 CEOs that do what I do that are friends of mine just the community is really just exceptional. And so yeah, I probably do. I did get swept in a little bit to a wonderful group.
It, Swept into the community is exactly. That's something that anyone serious about industry should consider, because the community they can make such a dramatic difference
Oh,
on
it's
where you
everything.
end up and your
It's
outcomes and your
everything.
road. Hmm.
Yeah. And that's been something I was just, so I have 4 teenagers. And I was just telling one of them yesterday at dinner, because they're 2 are in college and 2 are going to college in another year. So we're talking about ways to conduct yourself so that to influence what happens to you. And my advice is just say yes. Just say yes to projects you don't know how to do. Somebody asks you to do something, try it,
Hmm.
and if you're a quick study,
Hmm.
they'll let you do other things you don't know how to do.
Hmm. Hmm. That's right. That's right. Someone
Yep.
said to me once, "Say yes, even if your boots are shaking." And I think
That's
about
a good
that
one.
because it's true. There's so many things that we're held back by because we're afraid, or afraid of not doing an optimal job. We're afraid of what it means to be out of that comfort zone, out of those. But that is indeed where growth happens. And that is such a common denominator with
Yeah.
successful C-suite executives that I've worked with over the years, is that they really do throw that out. They get excited about that thrill of doing something for the first time and being pushed in a new area.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. And it's interesting. I love that you started with my background and how I grew up. And I love that you start with that with people, because I think if there is one common denominator to everybody, and how I conduct myself as a leader and how I would recommend most people do, is to just be aware that 100% of people are terrified of failure. And they are held back by the stuff that has happened to us in the past, and not being tone deaf to that, and being able to watch for like body language and signals of like intimidation, that they're feeling intimidated. It doesn't even have to be that I'm intimidating them. I mean, maybe I am, but that's them, right?
It's their interpretation of it. That's their
That's their
inter-
interpretation
Mhm.
of me, but me being tone deaf to that
Mhm.
doesn't make our connection more meaningful. It makes it less meaningful, right? So
Mhm.
um, I think that's part of the thing that I got from my dad as well, is just, you don't know what has happened to those people.
Mhm.
You don't know how they grew up. And if you look at the stats on depression, anxiety, everything in this country, and it's not just those people, it's high achievers too
Oh gosh, yes. Oh.
that have all of that. And so just creating an environment where people can still thrive and feel, kind of going back to your point about wanting to build systems and make things systematic, and that tunnel vision that STEM folks can sometimes get,
Mhm.
is that people want to be like that because it feels safe, but they most deeply want to be seen as a human, not as a machine,
Mhm.
right? And so building a system and a company where they get to show up and be themselves in a way that maybe they can't even be in
Mhm.
their families, right? Sometimes it feels safer for folks to try out new leadership capacities at work than at home.
Mhm. Without question. Yeah, and it's indirect but yet direct as I hear more about your leadership style and your sensitivity and empathy to the relationships that you're fostering around you. I imagine so much of that was ingrained with your father's role, and and accepting people for where they're at and not assuming as much as we do. Sometimes, especially, we walk into a boardroom, we walk into a meeting, everyone's wearing the same thing, everyone's working on the same device, everyone. So it's natural, it's human nature to say, oh, they're all coming from a place of safety, security, confidence. Eh,
Right?
we couldn't be more wrong. We have no idea what
Yeah,
everyone's
probably totally wrong.
the
Yeah.
the demons people are fighting, and the
Yeah.
mountains they've climbed to get there. So that's
Yeah.
really interesting. So there were some moments, and you've hinted at it, but I think it's really important. When did you know that leadership was your road, and you were in the trenches engineering wise, and you knew you enjoyed the business aspects as you got glimpse, which, by the way, I'm a huge fan for anyone coming out of college of these rotational programs. They give you more exposure to what great looks like in the big organizations that put them together than anything else you can do in 2 years' time. It's a
Absolutely.
huge
I couldn't
asset.
agree more. It was a wonderful, wonderful road with them. And Merck took really good care of me. And I learned things there that I still use, just the best practices.
Hmm.
Um, you sometimes have to bend that stuff to get things done in a smaller, less resourced environment, you
Hmm.
know? And so, but I agree. I think if all things being equal, young people would do well to start at the big companies rather than at a startup, so that they really do learn
Hmm.
best practices.
Yeah, and it always is. It depends. I've seen really interesting careers start with the first startup. I had an individual I was chatting with who ended up transacting one of the biggest deals in medtech after a number of years, and he had foregone a salaried job out of college to work for free. And I was more amazed by his wife that stood by him than I was about the actual deal. But it ended up paying off. But you're absolutely right. There's the exception to the rules, and sometimes you have to go with your gut if you believe in a North
Well, I said
Star.
all things being equal, which it isn't,
Right?
you know,
Right. Again, coming back to the human factor,
growing
right?
yeah, I love the way I did it. But in terms of when I knew about leadership, you know, I think it was really young. And it was reflexive. It wasn't like anyone gave me permission to be a leader. It was more, I just wanted to. I mean, everything around me that I saw, I wanted to contribute to. And so I guess probably it started in college with the Society of Women Engineers. So I was in a small school. Cooper Union only graduates about 100 engineers a year. So it's a small group of folks, and it's mostly not people who look like me. So I, rather than be intimidated by that, I felt kind of empowered by that. Like, oh, okay, so there's a voice here. There's a gap here that needs a voice. And there was a chapter of the Society of Women Engineers, and so I joined it. And as I went up and I got to my junior year, and I became the vice president. And then my senior year, I was president, and it just felt completely natural. And then I think going into the rotational program, where I was reporting to people who were much more senior than who I would have been reporting to if I had come into one of their Merck's normal entry level roles. I mean, I was 21 years old and sitting in the boardroom at Merck,
Wow.
watching my bosses and my team's bosses present to the president, you know, the division. That's not something I would have maybe ever seen in my career, you know. So I got a glimpse of what that kind of pressure looks like. That was intense. That was probably the most intense thing I'd seen. It gave me pause, and probably is one of the reasons why I'm not a big company person. I prefer the small, mid-sized companies. I think the creativity and that nimbleness is kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I maybe just then also, just to finish that story, reporting to those phenomenal leaders at that young age, I think it got it. That's how I grew up. And then once you get it, I don't think it's hard to let it go. It's fun. It's just fun.
So you saw it and you went for it. Did you have any early mentors at that period? Were there
Oh,
do you have mentors from Merck that you
yeah.
still?
Still really good friends with Erin Yaklich. She was my favorite boss. She was my boss in new products planning, right? So we were working on the launch of products that are now generic, but at the time they were very new and fancy. So Singulair for asthma,
Oh
uh,
wow.
rizatriptan, so Maxalt for migraines. My mom still takes generic rizatriptan, but as soon as it launched, she started on Maxalt, and it was just really fun. And Erin had this way, and if she's listening, I should text her later and tell her to listen. So a big shout out to Erin Yaklich, who was my favorite boss ever. She just had a way of being a really competent, clear executive, but still being a fully self-expressed woman with a sense of humor and the ability to just show up and be authentic and do really, really well. And I think I want to create that for everyone that works with me. You know, what's better than that?
I'm inspired. I want to be that too. That is ultimately what individuals want in leaders. They certainly want the leadership capability to move forward and to see that plan and that vision, but they want that arm around them and saying, I want you with me and I believe in you. And those two pieces of the puzzle aren't they're not always easy to bring together in one individual?
I've been very blessed with the people that I've reported to and that I've been around. I mean, I haven't had a lot of jobs. You know, four or five, but they're all of my CEOs have been lovely people who really cared about me and advocated for me. And if I was advocating for myself, had a lot of space for that.
Mhm.
And I do think advocating for yourself is important. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to just wander over and give you a promotion and a raise if you're not asking for it. So I did a fair amount of that too, but just a big shout out to all the CEOs that I work for, because it's really been a wonderful journey for me.
How did you take on that self-abdication? How did you allow that to become part of your daily interpretation of the world? Because that seems to be one of the most challenging characteristics for individuals to learn. And I will say, many women struggle with
Yeah,
this. You know,
yeah, yeah.
it's just a known fact that really advocating and advocating in a direct way is challenging.
It
And
can be. It can be. I mean, I think there's a couple pieces of it. You know, I think that what gets in the way for people is that we're brought up to make people feel comfortable, right? You're whatever. Don't make waves when you're a kid. Don't be so loud, right? There's just it's part of society, and I think it's more extreme for women, but it's everybody, right? And depending on how you grew up, being forthright and assertive might not have been even remotely acceptable in your family. In my family, it was totally acceptable. And my mother, I mean, she was just, we'll use air quotes, she was just a public school teacher. But in the summers, she didn't let a lot of grass grow. I mean, she applied for Fulbright grants and got scholarships and studied in France and, published things. And she was all over the place doing all kinds of cool things. That wasn't about money or prestige. It was about the joy of learning and becoming better. It was like if you've read, the Autonomy, Mastery, Purpose, Daniel Pink's work, just the joy of mastery and the purpose driven wanting to create horizons for young people. I think that it's that abundance based, when you're really tapping into who you are at your best, then we're not getting, it's not so either or. I think where people get tripped up is if I think me advocating for myself is somehow going to cost you something, right? And that was never, if I ever thought that, I wouldn't have done it, right? I was clear, like, if you let me do this, or get, if I have that, then these things are possible. And wouldn't that be nice for all of us? And I think that's really that for me has been the path forward. And I think people can feel it on the other side, right? You're not trying to take something from me.
mm-hmm.
You're trying to make the world better for all of us,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Lift the entire organization, lift the team by way of you becoming stronger in one area is going to allow the whole organization, business, goals, and going back to your mom, the household, right? It sounds like you had your parents were a great partnership. You had someone who wanted to do ambitiously different things and a household that supported that and allowed it
Yeah.
to continue to move
Well,
up.
two households actually, because they were divorced, but they were they were both good people and they were very different from each other, and they both loved us very much. So, and I think that was actually really good. My mom's the kind of person who will bounce the checkbook. My dad was super funny and the life of the party, and both of those things are, I think, kind of weave into my style. You got to balance the books. You got to manage the cash, but you want to have some fun too.
Yeah, exactly. Coming back to your engineering mindset with a high degree of empathy, you have to have the guardrails, right? We have to have the process and we have to have the structure and the big picture, but all the things that are going to happen in between. So here you are now. Let's say fast forward a bit. You're a leader. You're in your first or early leadership days. Were there any challenges you incurred? There perhaps a curveball or something that you weren't expecting. And curious on anything that you might share.
Yeah, well, I think that I mean, gosh, so many challenges, right? But I think a couple come up for me. I think there are environments where change and innovation is more challenging, right? And I spent a fair amount of time in those years in mid-sized companies where, an older company that had been around a while and was looking to reinvent itself and get to the new level. I learned so much at that company. I was chief strategy officer there and had a wonderful time. Peter Frost is still the CEO, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful guy, and still a beautiful company. Still really good friends with a lot of folks there. And I think what I learned there, came out of the biggest challenge, which was that when people have been doing something a particular way, so they're making medical devices, it was contract manufacturing for medical devices, and people have been doing something the same way for a while, it's hard to get them to change. And to our earlier conversation around um, that 100% of people have self-doubt, and it can be very terrifying if you ask them to change. We would say, hey, we want to try to get the efficiency of this line up, 50% or something like that. They hear me saying, you're not good enough, right? It has nothing to do with you. That's not what I said.
Mm-hmm.
But so the big strategic initiative that I spent several years working on there was very successful and very satisfying, was implementing lean manufacturing and operational excellence. And I love that stuff. Because any process that you don't spend some time with that way, the rule of thumb is it's at least 90% waste. So if you have the tools to look at something and say, okay, how could I take the waste out of this in a systematic way? You can get tremendous breakthrough. But you have to start with that thing that comes up for people, which is, I'm not good enough. Mm-hmm. I'm doing it wrong, right? They're hearing you criticize them. So that's really where I got very serious about leadership as a way of life at the company, not just for me, but for everybody. Everybody is a leader. Everyone is empowered to look around and say what's good enough and what's not good enough. And, so we were not able to really do anything. You can't just force these things on people. You have to create a system where an environment where they feel like it's their idea, that they're part. It's not, maybe that doesn't have to be their idea. It's not manipulating them like that, but it's like that they're in it. And my favorite story was my friend Rob in shipping. We wanted to redo the shipping area, and he was having none of it. He knew how to run his area. So helping, getting him off, like into a conference room for a day, buying sandwiches and getting people to sort of understand what this could look like, and then giving him a couple of tools. And then he went back to the shipping area with his new tools. And then he was the one that was like, oh, you mean that packaging that's way over there, I could move it here? Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice? Right. And then he's rearranging his space the way he wants it, so that what used to take 2 hours now takes 20 minutes. Now he's not stressed. His back doesn't hurt. He doesn't have this stressful day, and he's getting way more output with less effort. That's the whole promise of lean and operational excellence. But you're never going to get there until you get people to sort of let their guard down. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's probably a good story to leave you with.
That's an incredible story. And it's honestly, it's one of the ones I've heard where you can really see how tangible those steps could be, because I hear about these principles all the time going into a new organization and the friction that they are met with. And it does come back to how much buy-in does your team actually have to this change? Do they understand? Have you given them an opportunity to see the vision of a world with these perhaps improvements? Do they even know where you're going, or are they interpreting this as, I'm doing everything wrong and I'm no good in your eyes, and this is why we need to change? That's a huge nut to crack. I appreciate the more tactics that you gave us in terms of how you went about it. Taking them into the conference room. Sandwiches are always good. Add cookies and you got me.
These days it's salads. I'm dating myself with the sandwiches.
Yeah, right.
It's a salad now. Horrible.
But never skip the cookies. I don't care how many salads.
Absolutely.
Wow. So you've grown up as a leader. You've done some tremendous things. Tell us a little bit about Materna.
Oh, I love Materna. I chose Materna. So the board was looking for the commercial CEOs I mentioned, and they had a founder who is one of the most inspiring people. I mean, he worked at this for a lot of years before it was cool, before there was a thing called women's health. And when he was successfully raising money for the first chapter of the company, um, he was routinely told that women's health is not a market. And that sounds ridiculous to say now, right? But it's not been that long. I would say it's really turned around notably in the last 2 or 3 years.
Mhm.
But I joined a little before that, right before COVID started, and I wasn't really looking. I wasn't looking for a job, and I wasn't looking for a startup, and I hadn't heard of any of these issues. But I got really interested as I was hearing people at the company, the recruiter talk about it, and then the people at the company talk about it, how huge these issues are and how there's really nobody working on it. So we are first movers in our space, which is a huge challenge.
Mhm.
Right? There's a lot of education. Figuring out how to do that cost effectively is the thing we're working on. That's what we have to do. But the volume of patients that have no treatment at all. And so our first product received FDA clearance a year and a half ago, and then we just got OTC clearance a few months ago. Now we're an OTC on the market, B2B2C company, business to business to consumers. So we're really talking both to healthcare providers and to consumers, pulling through on what's called vaginismus. It's a high tone pelvic floor disorder. So primary symptom is painful sex. So totally stigmatized, hard to talk about.
Mhm.
Most people who have it have never heard of it. Most clinicians they go to didn't learn about it in medical school. So it's like this multi-billion-dollar hiding in plain sight. But we're not trying to do all of that. We're trying to establish the beachhead, right? That's
Mhm.
what startups do, and we do
Mhm.
it well. And our second product is the one I think everyone's really excited about. It's not as stigmatized because everybody's got a mom and everybody can get behind protecting mom. But we're trying to transform the standard of care in childbirth by trying to prevent pelvic floor injuries during vaginal delivery. And if you look at the literature, anywhere from 10 to 30% of the time, and we're seeing that in our study. In the control group, the muscles that hold our organs in place, the baby goes through those muscles
Mhm.
also. We think about tearing. I think everybody knows they don't want to tear.
Mhm.
Those are the visible lacerations you can see on the outside of the anatomy, but inside, you can only see it with ultrasound or MRI. These muscles that hold our organs in place, uh, they separate from the bone. And that injury is what leads to a lot of the pelvic mesh surgery. So about 200,000 people a year get a surgery for these disorders. And it's really that muscle injury is a surrogate endpoint for prolapse, pelvic organ prolapse. And the stories of people who have a pelvic organ prolapse are really quite sad. It's a very alienating and isolating condition. And I think a lot of people who have it don't realize that how common it is. Um, I've seen stats that say, maybe up to 50% of women will have some sort of incontinence and prolapse by the time they're 55. And I think that the stats that we quote are we are 5 times more likely to have those conditions if we've had a vaginal delivery. So the reason I took the job is that childbirth is the number one reason for hospitalization worldwide. Everybody knows people who've had babies. It's a
Mhm.
very common procedure. And right now, the standard of care is basically hoping for the best, right? Welcome to being a woman. You're probably going to be injured. 90% of people have lacerations during childbirth and other kinds of issues. OAC is one of our secondary endpoints. It's obstetric anal sphincter injury. This is where the baby actually pushes all the way through that muscle. So you're talking about fecal incontinence. Is 20% of births have that.
Wow.
And so, if you think about all your friends that have babies and you say, well, how's mom?
Mhm.
And she's great. She's home and resting.
Mhm.
Well, 20% of the time, she is not great.
Mhm.
And she's not telling you
Mhm.
because it's embarrassing. So the device that we are developing it's a dilator that basically it goes just inside the anatomy. So it's not up by the baby, it's not up by the cervix. It's just pre-stretching that muscle slowly over an hour, 1 millimeter at a time, limited by force. So as the tissue relaxes, the device can feel the force go down, it'll take up another millimeter. And what you're doing is stretching those muscles along the belly of the muscle and pre-stretching it. And then the device comes out, but those muscles stay stretchy for a few hours so that when the baby comes through, it doesn't tear at the tendon attachments and separate from the bone. The muscle has been pre-stretched along the belly of the muscle. And so the mom can get the baby out without pushing against her own pelvic floor.
And you start using it.
Study.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify that. Is that when contractions start? Is that the timeline?
So the part we think of as labor is normally people are thinking of phase 1 of labor, which is where contractions are happening and the cervix is beginning to dilate from 0 to 10 centimeters. And so when cervix is 10 centimeters, then the baby enters the birth canal and she can start pushing. And that's the second stage of labor. So that's a secondary endpoint for us too. We think maybe we can influence the duration of the second stage of labor. Like maybe the baby doesn't have to spend as much time in the birth canal and mom doesn't have to push so hard. So we're measuring all of that in our study as well. So there's a little bit of choreography here and some of the challenges that we've been challenged with by investors that passed on us, not the investors that we have, but some people were skeptical, like, do you really think you can get clinicians to change their workflow? Because they do. They have to sort of, when mom's cervix is sort of 6 centimeters on the way to 10, right? She's probably got a couple, 3 hours before she starts pushing. That's when they would place the device. So she's got an epidural, she's resting, she can't feel the device. But then, when she's ready to start pushing, the device is done when it's done, it's out of the way. And then that's the thing. What we found is that we enrolled our clinical sites really quickly. Our PIs don't necessarily haven't heard of this. It's new, but they know this is a big problem for their patients. The tearing and injuries are big and there's nothing for it. Like, I guess perineal massage with like olive oil, and that would be like standard of care there. So they just say, we know this is a huge problem for our patients and we're really excited to be part of this study. So
that's exciting. That is exciting. And it's much, much needed attention. One of the reasons I wanted to make sure we spoke about it is because the more I dug into it, this segment of the market is so highly underserved. And it starts with one of the points that you made is that people are embarrassed to talk about it. And it's not only something that we need to be talking about, we need to be looking at addressing it in different ways. The standard of care has got to be disrupted. It's been the same standard of care for many, many years. I mean, the only difference is the family can't smoke in the waiting room, I mean, there's really beyond that.
It hasn't changed a lot.
It hasn't
there hasn't
changed.
been a lot of innovation.
Yeah. And yet
epidural in the 1940s.
Yeah. And hemorrhaging and, so you've got some really lofty clinical goals. And I also want to make sure we call attention to the over-the-counter product that's there now to
I will, absolutely. I will. I think that just before we move on from the birth product, the reason that I took the job is that in the pilot study that the founder completed, they reduced pelvic floor injury by 60%.
Wow.
And I am not able to disclose, but we do this again next year. I look forward to sharing maybe even some more good news with you.
Yes. Yes.
And so it's so exciting to think that we could have that kind of impact. Like if it's a surrogate endpoint for those pelvic floor injury, the pelvic floor injury is surrogate for prolapse. What if prolapse became a thing of the past, right? Not just something that's inevitable for old ladies, right? So, so super excited. And reaching first-time moms is relatively straightforward. I look forward to commercializing that device. I think it's going to be really fun and interesting. It's probably going to be spicy. Like there's a lot of opinions about birth plans, but we're going to be following. Our first product is setting down our go-to-market strategy. So I'll talk about that in a second. But a lot of medical devices that are used in hospitals, that the patient really doesn't know anything about the device. Like they don't need to know anything. What brand catheter they got, or what brand even hip they got. That's a decision that the doctor and hospital make. With this is a this is going to be part of the birth plan. And so
Mhm.
the consumer does need to be consulted, but the doctor also needs to be informed and able to place the device. So we're following um, the go-to-market strategy around the cord blood preservation kits. So if anybody's ever had their baby stem cells preserved, this is
Mhm.
a medical device that's waiting for mom at the hospital.
Mhm.
Doctor knows how to use it. Hospital stocks it. Mom makes the decision to pay extra to have it. But where I'd really love to pick up is around health equity.
Mhm.
You talked about maternal outcomes, but they're also skewed along racial lines. And the
Horribly
way the
skewed.
healthcare reimbursement system is set up,
Mhm.
this is going to be a little bit of a long road to make it to have for health equity,
Mhm.
right? And so we're making that into the clinical endpoints that we're picking up, and working hard to make sure that we've got diversity in our trial,
Mhm.
so it's representative of the population in the United States, where we tend to have our beachhead. Um,
Well,
it's
it's a
not
great time. It's a
not
great
easy.
time. No, it's certainly
Medicaid.
not easy. You haven't taken on anything easy throughout your career, but that's where really big warriors are made. I must commend you on how far you've come, and I do agree that the time is now for women's health. In the last 3 years, I have seen more turnaround on investor perception and
Yes.
investment dollars in medical, women's health focused uh, products, services, femtech, and the like. And
100%.
we can say it's because women are important, but it's also, frankly, it's just great business with women
Yes.
making the majority, the great majority of health decisions in the household, and the women population slowly ticking over 50%. We have to pay attention to these factors. It's something
Yes.
loud and clear. So I love what you're doing there. I love the challenge from a career development perspective that this kind of opportunity provides someone in the C-suite because you man direct to consumer, direct to clinician, you've got trials, you've got investor, and oh by the way, you're still really a startup, a scrappy
I'm still a
startup,
startup
you
trying to
know.
do all these things. Right.
You've
It's
got it
busy.
done.
2 products and all of the clinical research, the regulatory, the product development, and the sales and marketing. Got it all.
Got it all going. Wow. Well, I could probably speak with you for a lot longer, Tracy. You've gotten so many things, but I know we're hitting on time. Is there anything that you would like to share with the audience that, especially as you think about where you're at, any pieces of advice that you might share to people who are saying, "Gosh, I want to be like Tracy when I grow up. I'd love to be. I'd love to sit in the C-suite. I'd love to drive high performance teams. I'd love to get into these kinds of scenarios." Anything that you would offer?
Well, I mean, number one is, like Dolly Parton says, figure out who you are and then go do it on purpose. I definitely think it's all about authenticity and being yourself. So you don't have to be somebody else to be a CEO. And I think you want to be clear about what your strong suits are, right? So for me, commercial strategy and finance are my strong suits, right? So clinical research, I'm much better at it now, but I still have an incredible clinical leader. And my first hire was a chief operating officer who has that quality regulatory, detail oriented. So I'm like on the Myers-Briggs, I'm kind of in the middle on big picture details. Like I can ladder up and down if I need to, but I'm just sort of naturally in the middle myself. And so having people for me that are detail oriented, super important to keep me on the rails. But also I have a wonderful board. Big shout out to Dr. Ariella Gollum, our board chair, who was looking for a women's health investment and has made an incredible contribution to the company. She's got her eyes on the horizon and the big picture. And getting a big exit in women's health is important to us. We want to make it easier for the next group to get funded because investors need the pattern,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
They're willing to take on risk, but they want to see how this is working and if this is real, right? And it's definitely real. We're starting to see those exits, and
Mhm.
really excited for the next one.
That's great. So keep your eye on the North Star. Build
Mhm.
that high performance team around your superhero powers, right? And make
Yep,
sure you have a board that is supportive and committed to your cause.
100%.
Yeah,
Yep,
that's
that's it.
excellent. That's excellent. Tracy, thank you so much. You've been an amazing guest. I knew you would be. I appreciate your time
Thank you so
and
much.
thank you
It was
for
such a
sharing the
pleasure.
wisdom with the
Oh,
audience.
it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And for all of us who've joined us today, thanks for joining us on the Power Curve. We'll see you next time.